Hello everyone, and welcome back to our quiet corner of history where the grand narratives of the past gently unfurl, inviting you to drift into contemplation. As the world outside perhaps winds down, or as you simply seek a moment of calm reflection, we're going to journey back to a civilization that to many symbolizes timeless majesty and serene grandeur, ancient Egypt. We often picture golden pharaohs, soaring pyramids, and the tranquil flow of the Nile, a landscape bathed in an almost mythical glow. Yet beneath that shimmering surface, for the vast majority who called this land home, daily life was not merely challenging. It was by almost any modern standard relentlessly brutal. It was a world where survival was a daily conquest, and the forces of nature, society and power converged to forge an existence of profound hardship and ceaseless toil. If you genuinely find peace and insight in what we do here, a quiet moment to subscribe, and perhaps a gentle like on this article, would mean a great deal helping these historical whispers find more receptive ears. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to the very bedrock of their harsh reality, beginning with the foundations that shaped every single life. Imagine, if you will, the social landscape of ancient Egypt not as a gentle slope, but as a towering, unforgiving pyramid, each stone representing a layer of human existence, with the weight of all above crushing down on those below. At its absolute unreachable apex stood the pharaoh, not merely a king, but a living deity, a divine embodiment of order on earth. His very word was unquestionable law, capable of shaping destinies with a casual utterance, often as distant and remote as the gods he was said to represent. Beneath this almost mythical figure, a minuscule elite, the nobles, the priests and the scribes clung precariously to their elevated perch. Their power and privilege were immense, a birthright often reinforced by their close proximity to the perceived divine authority, rendering them seemingly untouchable by the harsh realities that governed the lives of others. They navigated their existence with an air of assured command, their days marked by comfort and influence, while the vast expanse of humanity beneath them wrestled with an entirely different set of circumstances. The sheer scale of the population at the pyramid's base was staggering. Here the vast majority toiled relentlessly as peasants, as labourers, and in perhaps the most agonizing twist of fate as enslaved individuals. Their destiny was rigidly fixed at birth, a cruel lottery ticket that offered virtually no hope of upward social mobility. Once born into this tier, you were for all intents and purposes bound to your birth status, a future already charted with unforgiving precision. This inherent calcified rigidity within the social structure fostered a systemic dehumanization of the lower classes, stripping away their individuality. They were viewed primarily as expendable resources, mere cogs in the pharaoh's grand divine machine existing solely to serve the state and its sacred ruler. Their personal aspirations, their unique struggles, their very humanity were often swallowed whole by the overwhelming demands of the collective, their lives a silent testament to the needs of the empire rather than their own. And so the system ensured that power and resources flowed relentlessly upwards, a ceaseless current pulling wealth and comfort from the masses towards the privileged few. This created and cemented the precarious and often agonizing existence of the average Egyptian. Their sweat, their blood, their very lives literally built and sustained this dazzling civilization, yet they saw little of its splendour for themselves. From within their cramped, often reeking mud brick hovels, the average Egyptian might catch a fleeting glimpse of the gold-bedecked pharaoh, perhaps during a rare procession, a distant shimmering spectacle of unreachable opulence. But a closer, more honest look at their own lives, and the lives of those around them, invariably revealed the heavy toll paid by kings and commoners alike, in this demanding world where adversity and affliction were constant, unyielding companions. This existence, you see, was profoundly defined by the very unpredictable pulse of their land, That profound definition of their existence, the very pulse of Egyptian life, was inextricably tied to the grand life-giving and often terrifying Nile River. For the ancient Egyptians, life's fortunes were dictated by the river's fickle whims, a powerful artery that pulsed through the heart of their agrarian economy. Its annual inundation, that miraculous swell of water spilling over its banks, was undeniably the sole source of fertility, depositing the vital nutrient-rich black silt that transformed the arid landscape into a lush, arable paradise. This was the gift, the reason for Egypt's very existence, allowing for bountiful harvests of wheat barley, and the humble vegetables that formed the cornerstone of their sustenance. Yet, and here's the brutal truth of it, the Nile was notoriously unreliable, a source of constant gnawing anxiety that burrowed deep into the minds of every farmer, every family. You could practically feel the collective breath held each year as the floodwaters approached, wondering if the river would bless or betray them. Anemic floods, those years when the Nile's vital surge fell short, meant parched fields and withered crops, a grim prophecy unfolding before their eyes. This wasn't merely a bad season. It unleashed the terrifying spectre of widespread famine, a horror that haunted generations. When the granaries emptied and the bellies ached, people were driven to truly desperate measures for survival choices that would churn the stomach even millennia later. Records chillingly suggest instances of cannibalism, a last horrifying resort even recorded during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser, or Jose way back in the early dynasties around 2670 BC. Imagine the sheer unimaginable desperation required to cross that boundary. Conversely, and adding another layer of terror, overly high floods could unleash raging, uncontrollable currents that washed away entire villages in a sudden, violent torrent. Homes, livelihoods, precious livestock, all vanished beneath the churning brown waters, leaving thousands destitute, their already precarious lives brutally upended in a single watery disaster. The very currency of this brutal economy was grain, a tangible measure of survival, and the state, along with the powerful temples, exacted heavy taxes in kind, demanding a significant portion of these precious harvests. This often left many families teetering on the knife edge of subsistence, a constant low-level hum of dread accompanying their daily calculations. The ever-present threat of losing everything, a bad harvest, a sudden illness, and unexpected demand, was never far from their minds. This profound economic precarity frequently plunged families into inescapable debt bondage, a soul-crushing reality, where desperation forced parents to make an agonizing choice to sell themselves, or even their own children, into servitude to creditors or to the state. It was a choice between immediate agonizing starvation and a life of forced labor, a stark illustration of the brutal calculus of survival. Then there was corvée labor, theoretically a form of taxation, that was supposed to occur during the flood season when the fields lay fallow anyway, a civic duty for the idle hands. But in practice, and quite frequently, this system devolved into outright slavery, compelling peasants, who often had families to feed and fields to prepare, to undertake back-breaking monumental work on the pharaoh's colossal structures. You might find yourself, a humble farmer, suddenly conscripted to haul immense stones or mud bricks under a scorching sun, your muscles burning, your spirit waning. This forced labour, extracted from the backbone of society, provided the physical force that built the very symbols of Egypt's grandeur. These were not voluntary acts of devotion, but enforced acts of survival, where the whims of the Nile and the unyielding demands of the state conspired to define every moment. Beyond the caprices of the river and the state, the very land itself harboured a constant array of insidious threats, tiny and massive, waiting to inflict their own unique brand of suffering. Beyond the fickle whims of the Nile and the crushing weight of the state, nature itself presented an unforgiving, omnipresent fury in ancient Egypt, a relentless barrage of pervasive threats that made life a constant negotiation with danger. You might imagine the sun a benevolent force essential for ripening crops and drying the very mud bricks that built their homes. Yet that blazing Egyptian sun, while vital, relentlessly scorched the labourers who stacked those mud bricks ever skyward, turning the grand construction sites into furnaces of suffering. Debilitating heat stroke and agonising dehydration were silent killers felling many who toiled under its unyielding gaze, their bodies simply giving out under the strain. It wasn't a dramatic end, perhaps, but a slow, brutal depletion of life force, a quiet collapse beneath an indifferent sky. But the elements were just one facet of nature's indifference. Beyond floods, the land itself posed systemic challenges that could shatter a community's fragile hold on existence. Major locust plagues, for instance, could descend with terrifying swiftness, darkening the skies like an ominous cloud. And these weren't just a nuisance. They stripped fields bare in a matter of hours, consuming a quarter of a precious harvest and unleashing devastating famines in their wake. Imagine working tirelessly all year only to watch your family's future devoured by a swirling, chittering swarm, the sound of their chewing a grim symphony of despair. The Nile's murky waters, the very source of life, also harboured apex predators that brought sudden, brutal death. Enormous Nile crocodiles up to 20 feet long with crushing jaws lurked beneath the surface, a silent threat to anyone daring to draw water or cross the river. And then there were the ferociously territorial hippos, surprisingly nimble and incredibly dangerous, capable of running at 20 per riand, and with one swing of their massive tusks slicing a man in half. Every trip to the river was in essence a gamble with your life. The arid desert borders stretching endlessly beyond the cultivated land were prowled by other large predators. Lions, often depicted in royal hunts, weren't just distant curiosities. They stalked the edges of civilization, a chilling reminder that no Egyptian, no matter their status, was ever truly far from something that could kill them. The story of the herdsman taboo mauled by one such beast was not just a tale, but a stark warning echoing through the villages. And yet perhaps the most insidious dangers came not from the grand visible predators, but from tiny, almost imperceptible creatures that made life a constant misery. Mosquitoes with their incessant buzzing were silent vectors of disease spreading malaria and yellow fever. Biting black flies could cause blindness, a truly horrifying prospect in a world without welfare. And filth flies, drawn to the pervasive unhygienic conditions, were relentless spreaders of dysentery and enteric diseases, making life a constant low-grade torment, their buzzing a relentless soundtrack of suffering. Lice and fleas were ubiquitous, infesting hair clothing and bedding, tormenting their hosts, with ceaseless itching and biting a constant irritating reminder of the lack of basic cleanliness. Adding to this internal misery, intestinal worms robbed bodies of precious nutrients, highlighting the constant unhygienic struggle. The brutal irony was that amidst all these natural threats, the scorching sun, the unpredictable river, the ravenous plagues, the lurking predators, and the insidious insects, there was a systemic lack of formal relief efforts or advanced medical knowledge. Communities and individuals largely bore the full brutal brunt of environmental disasters and natural dangers alone. They endured immense suffering without state aid or effective treatment, their resilience a testament to their spirit, their pain a stark indicator of their profound vulnerability. This constant onslaught from the natural world meant that every day was a battle for survival, a battle fought within the confines of their harsh living conditions and with the gnawing pangs of hunger that were often their closest companions. As the grand macro-realities of Egypt's social structure, economic pressures and natural threats loomed large individual lives played out within these brutal confines, revealing the deeply personal and often agonizing struggles of daily existence. So let's gently peel back the layers and step inside the typical commoner's home, if you can call it that, To truly grasp the harshness of their living conditions and the primitiveness of their shelter, you'd likely find yourself in a small, cramped mud brick house, perhaps just a few rooms clustered around an open courtyard. The air inside would perpetually reek of damp earth, a consequence of the Nile's proximity, and the acrid smell of hearth ash, a constant companion to their lives. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury virtually unknown, a concept for which there was little space in these close-knit, often crowded dwellings. The roofs, crudely fashioned from palm logs and thatch, offered only minimal protection against the elements, a constant source of pervasive discomfort. By day, the scorching sun would inevitably find its way through the gaps, turning the interior into a stifling oven. By night, the frigid desert air would seep in, bringing a bone-chilling cold that gnawed at any semblance of peace. Furniture was starkly, almost painfully minimal. Forget elaborate beds or comfortable chairs. A low stool might be your sole perch, a simple wooden headrest would cradle your neck for sleep, and woven reed mats on packed dirt floors served as your bed. These provided hard, uncomfortable rest, if you could call it rest, after a day of ceaseless, bone-wearing toil in the fields or on colossal construction sites. The body, constantly pushed to its limits, found little solace even in its moments of supposed repose. And if the elements and the hard surfaces weren't enough, your humble dwelling would also be a regular thoroughfare for unwelcome guests. Vermin, including scuttling rodents, venomous scorpions and slithering snakes, frequently crept in through the unsealed crevices and doorways, turning a place of supposed refuge into a source of constant anxiety and threat. Every rustle, every shadow could be a harbinger of danger, adding another layer of low-level stress to an already burdened life. In sharp, almost mocking contrast, the ruling elites resided in opulent palaces. These grand abodes boasted cool-shaded interiors, a marvel of ancient architecture and design that offered true respite from the sun. They were furnished with lavish, comfortable items, and servants attended to their every need, anticipating desires before they were even voiced. It was a stark visual representation of societal disparity, a clear demarcation between the few who lived in comfort and the many who endured ceaseless hardship. Even the organized worker villages at pyramid sites, a marvel of ancient urban planning, while providing certain communal amenities, offered only basic crowded mud brick apartments. Here the physical demands of the grueling labour permeated every moment of existence, even during the precious hours of rest. You were never truly off the clock. The aches and pains from hauling immense blocks, the constant exhaustion, the ever-present dust were carried into your sleeping quarters, a grim reminder of your daily purpose. This was a life where comfort was a fleeting illusion, and the continuous battle for respite from physical and environmental demands shaped every waking and sleeping moment. This unrelenting strain was further compounded by the stark realities of their daily sustenance. This unrelenting strain, born from harsh living conditions, was matched, perhaps even surpassed, by the relentless monotony and gnawing pangs of hunger that defined the Egyptian diet for the vast majority. You'd wake, if sleep had even provided much true rest, to the same sparse meal, day in and day out, a predictable cycle of coarse bread and beer. This was the bedrock of their sustenance, supplemented only with the most basic of vegetables, like onions, lentils, and radishes, often consumed in silence. Each bite a practical act of survival rather than enjoyment. Imagine a lifetime where culinary variety was a concept utterly foreign, where every meal was merely fuel, a desperate attempt to fend off the constant internal gnawing. Meat, that rich source of protein and flavour, was a rare and coveted luxury almost entirely confined to the elite, or reserved for religious festivals. For the commoner, the smell of roasting meat would have been an exotic, perhaps even mythical aroma, a constant reminder of the scarcity that defined most Egyptians' lives. Their bodies, perpetually operating on the bare minimum, bore the marks of this constant deprivation. Malnutrition was rampant, leaving entire populations vulnerable to a host of debilitating afflictions like anemia, a pervasive weariness that clung to every movement, scurvy with its painful joint swelling and bleeding gums and various bone deformities, twisting limbs and spines into unnatural shapes. The very appearance of many ancient Egyptians visible in skeletal remains, and ancient art reflected their constant, subtle, yet profoundly impactful state of nutritional deficiency. The fear of food scarcity was an ever-present spectre, a shadow that stretched over every field and every granary. This led to a constant, desperate scramble for sustenance, a hand-to-mouth existence where families were always just one poor harvest away from the agonizing, almost certain reality of starvation. It was a delicate balance, a constant calculation of risk and reward in the face of nature's unpredictable temperament. Food preservation methods were rudimentary at best, making seasonal dependence acutely severe and highly vulnerable to devastating pest infestations. A granary painstakingly filled after a long harvest could become a breeding ground for weevils or rodents, spoiling precious stores with terrifying swiftness. The smell of rotting grain, that putrid, sickly sweet scent, would have been a harbinger of despair, signifying not just lost food, but lost hope, lost futures. Adding insult to injury, or rather starvation to deprivation, was the immense pressure to hand over a sizable portion of their meagre harvests as taxes. This further exacerbated the precariousness of their existence, leaving many farmers with barely enough or often not enough to feed their own families. You worked your fingers to the bone, you prayed for a good flood, you battled the pests only for a significant portion of your hard-earned sustenance to be taken away. Your efforts, your very survival, often felt for naught, swallowed by the insatiable demands of the state. This relentless cycle of deprivation, combined with the utterly basic hygiene standards of the era, created an environment of pervasive discomfort that infiltrated every aspect of their personal realities. The monotonous diet and gnawing hunger were only part of the daily grind. The very air they breathed and the surfaces they touched contributed to a pervasive discomfort rooted in rudimentary hygiene. Imagine starting your day with a wash-a-necessary ritual. This daily cleansing involved cold water, likely drawn directly from the Nile, a source of both life and potential contaminants, or from a well with rudimentary soap if any was available at all. This provided little genuine relief from the pervasive grime, the omnipresent dust, and the ever-present sweat that clung stubbornly to their bodies in the searing, relentless Egyptian heat. True cleanliness, by any modern standard, was an elusive dream, a fleeting sensation rather than a sustained state. Sanitation, or rather the distinct lack thereof, was primitive in the extreme. Garbage and human waste often piled in fetid, reeking heaps near living quarters, sometimes even directly outside the mud-brick homes. These decaying mounds attracted swarms of buzzing flies, a constant, irritating cloud that followed them everywhere and became potent vectors for spreading disease. The stench, a truly overwhelming assault on the senses, was an ever-present reality of their environment, a grim testament to the challenges of managing waste in a dense, hot climate. It was the background scent of their lives, perhaps so ubiquitous it became almost imperceptible, yet it undeniably contributed to the persistent ill health that plagued the population. And speaking of persistent annoyances, the incessant itch of lice and fleas was an inescapable torment, a constant companion. These tiny, maddening creatures infested hair clothing, and bedding, turning rest into another battleground. You would scratch endlessly, a futile attempt to gain relief, but the biting and itching were relentless, a constant irritating reminder of the lack of basic cleanliness and the pervasive reality of parasites. For many, the concept of a clean, uninfested body might have been as aspirational as a full granary. Furthermore, most people possessed only a single linen garment, a simple tunic or wrap which they wore continuously day in and day out, until it literally rotted off their backs. This contributed immensely to physical discomfort, of course, but also facilitated the rapid spread of skin infections and diseases, turning a minor abrasion into a potentially life-threatening condition. While not always overtly ritualistic in the spiritual sense, the constant struggle to maintain any semblance of personal cleanliness was in itself a daily ritual of endurance. It was a testament to the harsh realities of their environment, a small futile act of defiance against the overwhelming forces of dirt and disease. In contrast, specific, often elaborate grooming standards did exist for elite women and men. They had access to oils, perfumes, and even rudimentary cosmetics, striving for a polished appearance. But even their efforts, luxurious as they might seem, were often thwarted by the overall lack of advanced hygienic knowledge and effective sanitation systems, making true pervasive cleanliness elusive even for those at the top. This pervasive discomfort, the itching, the smells, the dirt, served as a perpetual backdrop to the true defining feature of the average Egyptian's life, the ceaseless, back-breaking labour that marked every single day. That pervasive discomfort, the gnawing hunger, and the persistent itch were but footnotes to the overarching reality. For the vast majority of Egyptians, a life that was a continuous brutal cycle of dawn to dusk drudgery. You see, for them, existence was defined by back-breaking labour in the fields, a relentless sequence of tasks like ploughing the sun-baked earth, planting precious seeds and harvesting under the relentless scorching sun. There was no reprieve, no days off, just an endless repetition of physically demanding work dictated by the seasons and the demands of survival. The physical demands of this agricultural life were immense, truly pushing the human body to its limits. Imagine operating a crude wooden plough, perhaps pulled by oxen, the sheer effort required to bite into the unyielding earth, the strain in your arms, your back, your legs. Then came the endless task of hauling heavy buckets of water from the Nile, or from a network of canals to irrigate parched crops, each drop a precious commodity, each bucket a testament to pure physical endurance. Your muscles would burn, your shoulders ache, and your hands would be calloused and cracked, a permanent testament to the ceaseless physical toll. This was not merely work, it was an act of constant full-body engagement with the earth, a battle against nature's indifference. And then for those conscripted into corvée labour, that dreaded form of state-mandated work, the physical toll was beyond imagining. This was where the true crippling brutality of the system manifested. Picture yourself a farmer suddenly ordered to haul colossal loads of mud and stone for miles, the sun beating down the overseer's whip a constant threat, or digging canals, repairing dikes after a flood, or perhaps most iconically dragging immense statues and obelisks across vast distances. These tasks often resulted in crippling injuries, backs, permanently bowed shoulders, dislocated limbs broken in agonizing ways, often with no hope of recovery. A single accident could condemn you to a life of disability, making you a burden, rather than a productive member of society, a grim fate in a world with no safety net. Worksite hazards were severe and alarmingly common. Men dropped from sheer exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out under the strain of relentless labour and insufficient sustenance. Others were crushed by falling blocks, their lives extinguished in an instant beneath tons of stone. Pulley failures, rudimentary scaffolding collapsing or suffering agonizing gashes from flint axes and other primitive tools were regular occurrences, each potential death sentence or a guarantor of permanent disfigurement. Archaeological excavations of worker cemeteries grimly illustrate these hardships, painting a stark, silent picture of lives defined by struggle. Skeletons unearthed from these ancient burial grounds frequently show severe arthritis, especially in the spine, and major joints, clear indicators of years of heavy lifting and repetitive strain. Spinal deformities from carrying immense loads were common, and numerous healed but crooked fractures bones that never quite set right served as stark marks of a life of ceaseless brutal toil where medical care was minimal and recovery often incomplete. For those truly at the bottom, particularly enslaved individuals in the gold mines like Burm-Fawahia conditions were often described as hellish and brutal tenfold. Imagine scorched skin from the relentless sun, bleeding feet from walking miles over jagged terrain, and the constant threat of collapse from silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling dust, a slow, agonizing suffocation. Even the labour of the pharaohs themselves, like warrior King Thutmose III, involved grueling military campaigns, long marches through parched deserts, and the profound mental and physical strain of command. But crucially, this was labour undertaken from a position of absolute power, not from one of crushing subjugation. This relentless, back-breaking toil was the very engine of Egyptian society, but it extracted an unceasing brutal price from its most vulnerable citizens, a toll that began for many at an alarmingly young age. This unceasing brutal price exacted by the relentless toil of adult life was often paid even earlier for many, beginning in the brutal gauntlet of childhood where survival itself was a terrifying gamble. You might wish for a tender, carefree infancy, but for ancient Egyptian children such a concept was a fleeting luxury. Child mortality rates were appallingly, heart-wrenchingly high. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 3 infants never even saw their first birthday, their tiny lives extinguished almost as soon as they began. And even if they passed that initial perilous milestone, only about half of all children survived to see the age of 5. This meant that tiny, sorrowful graves were heartbreakingly common, a grim landscape of lost potential scattered throughout every burial ground, a constant reminder of the fragility of early life. The primary causes of this horrifying attrition were predictably severe malnutrition, which weakened tiny bodies and left them utterly defenceless. Then came the onslaught of rampant infectious diseases: smallpox, tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, cholera, tetanus, and diphtheria, each a potential death sentence in a world without vaccines or antibiotics. And beyond disease, frequent, often fatal accidents lurked around every corner. Drownings in the life-giving yet equally dangerous Nile were common, as were animal attacks or simple falls in a world devoid of safety measures. The profound sorrow and trauma of losing a child was so common, so pervasive, that parents often delayed naming their babies for months, sometimes even a year. This was a poignant, almost heartbreaking attempt to brace themselves for the near-inevitable loss, a desperate silent ritual to temper their grief, to hold back the full force of attachment, until a fragile hope of survival had blossomed. For the children who survived infancy, childhood was starkly brief, a fleeting period of innocence before the responsibilities of adulthood descended. Most were put to work at a very young age, their small hands and undeveloped bodies pressed into service. You might find yourself barely old enough to walk steadily, assisting in the fields, fetching water, tending livestock, or learning a craft alongside your parents. This immediate integration into the workforce effectively denied them the precious innocence of unburdened play, turning childhood into a prelude to labour. Peasant children in particular were forced into back-breaking agricultural labour, their small frames straining under tasks meant for adults. Even more tragically, some were sold into domestic servitude to pay off their parents' inescapable debts, becoming pawns in a brutal economic system. Such early, intense physical tolls often resulted in stunted growth and spinal deformities, visible markers of hardship that would literally mark them for life, a legacy of childhood brutality etched onto their very bones. Education, as we understand it, was a rare and precious privilege largely confined to the children of the elite. These fortunate few received formal academic and martial studies meticulously prepared for their future roles as scribes, priests, or military commanders, the intellectual and strategic backbone of the empire. This opportunity, a gateway to a different kind of life, was systematically denied to the vast masses cementing their fixed place at the bottom of the social pyramid. Even royal children, despite their initial comforts, faced rigid discipline and immense expectations, their childhood largely a preordained prelude to their adult roles as tragically exemplified by the stillborn daughters of Tutankhamun. Poignant grave goods, miniature combs, tiny toy figurines, rattles fashioned from turtle shells, found alongside small skeletons in humble graves, serve as whispering remnants of a parent's desperate attempt to provision their lost child for an afterlife. These small, silent offerings are an enduring, heart-wrenching testament to unending grief, a final, futile gesture of love in the face of insurmountable loss. This immense personal suffering, of course, always existed within the very visible and often terrifying structures of power and control. Always present, this immense personal suffering existed within the very visible and often terrifying structures of power and control, dictating fates with merciless efficiency. At the very pinnacle of this formidable hierarchy, as we've touched upon, lay the pharaoh's authority, which was absolute. This wasn't merely political power. It stemmed from his perceived divine mandate, a direct connection to the gods that demanded unquestioning obedience from every soul in the land. This absolute power cascaded down the entire social structure, often enforced with a chilling lack of mercy, creating a system where the individual was truly subservient to the state, embodying the very essence of top-down control. While the pharaoh certainly held immense symbolic and spiritual power, his practical rule was perhaps paradoxically both absolute and at times precarious. It was absolute in the sense that his decrees were law and his will supreme. Yet it could become precarious, particularly when the very foundations of society were shaken by existential threats, like prolonged famine as we've seen, or overwhelming external invasions. In such moments of profound crisis, even a divine king could face internal unrest and challenges to his authority, though these were rare and swiftly dealt with. Still, for the average Egyptian, the pharaoh was a distant, untouchable figure, his power manifest through a vast network of administrators. Local governors known as nomarchs and high priests acted as regional extensions of the pharaoh's formidable power, wielding immense influence even over life and death within their respective territories. Their decisions, their whims directly impacted the daily lives of thousands, reflecting the pervasive nature of central control spread throughout the kingdom. These were the faces of pharaonic authority that most Egyptians would actually encounter, not the distant god-king, but his very real, very tangible representatives. And supporting this administrative backbone were the army and the scribes, two crucial pillars that served as direct enforcers and administrators of the pharaonic will. The army, a well-oiled machine, ensured the collection of heavy taxes maintained order, and perhaps most dreaded facilitated conscription for monumental state projects like pyramids and temples, or for military campaigns. The scribes, meticulous record keepers and bureaucrats, managed the complex logistics of the empire, ensuring that every grain, every labourer, every tax payment was accounted for, leaving no room for evasion. This absolute pervasive control permeated every conceivable aspect of life, from the precise allocation of precious resources, who got what and when, to the much broader, almost philosophical maintenance of cosmic order known as Ma'at, through strict adherence to the ruler's decrees. Ma'at was the principle of truth, justice, and balance, and the pharaoh was its earthly guardian. Therefore, disobeying the pharaoh was not just a crime. It was an act against cosmic order itself, a profound transgression. This left very little room for individual thought, independent action, or deviation from the prescribed path. The reign of warrior kings like Thutmose III in the 15th century BC exemplified the brutal application of this power through relentless military campaigns, expanding the empire's borders with a heavy, agonizing toll of human lives. This constant demand for unquestioning obedience and the swift, often terrifying retribution for non-compliance created a climate of pervasive fear that permeated every social interaction and every personal decision, filtering down relentlessly from the top. This pervasive fear, you see, was meticulously codified in their harsh legal system. This pervasive fear, meticulously codified in their harsh legal system, found its most tangible and chilling expression in the enforcement mechanisms of ancient Egyptian society. You might imagine a nuanced system of justice, but the reality was starkly arbitrary, often devoid of anything resembling modern due process. The will of immediate superiors, be it a local governor, a high priest, or even a particularly influential foreman, or ultimately the pharaoh himself, often served as the ultimate law. This left individuals with virtually no legal rights, no avenues for appeal, and minimal protections against even the most severe injustices. Your fate could hinge on the mood of an official, a truly terrifying thought, in a world where every decision could be a matter of life or death. Public punishments were not just common, they were deliberately brutal spectacles designed not merely to punish the individual wrongdoer, but to serve as a terrifying public deterrent. Imagine witnessing such a display. The pain inflicted was meant to instill a deep, visceral fear in the masses, a chilling warning against future transgressions. It was theatre of cruelty calculated to maintain rigid social order through intimidation. While ancient Egypt didn't have a formal system quite like the Goningumi of feudal Japan, where groups were held collectively responsible, a similar principle of collective responsibility was implicitly enforced. The severe consequences imposed upon families and entire communities for individual crimes, particularly those that threatened the state or divine order, ensured that neighbours watched neighbours and families held their members accountable, driven by the fear of shared suffering. A transgression by one could bring ruin upon many, creating a pervasive atmosphere of mutual suspicion and implicit control. Perhaps most chillingly, confession was frequently extracted through agonizing torture. Accounts detailing the interrogations of tomb robbers, for instance, paint a grim picture of suspects being beaten, stretched, and twisted until they confessed, often implicating others in their agony. These records highlight the cruel realities of legal enforcement in ancient Egypt, revealing a system more concerned with extracting compliance and information by any means necessary than with establishing objective truth. The complete lack of individual rights meant that one's fate was entirely at the mercy of those in power. There was little to no legal recourse or appeal against even the most severe injustices. Once accused, particularly by a powerful figure, your chances of vindication were slim to none. Your voice, your pleas, your very existence held little weight against the machinery of state power. Crimes against the state or divine order, especially the egregious act of tomb robbery, were met with the most horrific forms of execution and post-mortem desecration. This wasn't simply about punishing the living. It was expressly designed to doom one's soul to oblivion and prevent entry into the revered afterlife, the paradise of the field of reeds. It was a double punishment, extinguishing the body and annihilating the soul, a fate more terrifying than death itself for a people obsessed with eternity. The decree by Pharaoh Snefru chillingly stating that enslaved individuals could be put to death for their master's crimes and their skins stretched over his drums vividly, illustrates the complete dehumanization enshrined in law. It speaks volumes about a system where human life, particularly that of the vulnerable, was reduced to a mere commodity, a tool to be used and discarded, its very essence, subject to the whims of the powerful. This deep connection between crime punishment and the afterlife casts a long, terrifying shadow, making honour and the fate of the soul paramount tools of societal control. Casting a long, terrifying shadow, the concept of death in ancient Egypt was far more than just a physical event. It was deeply interwoven with honour and societal control, particularly in the context of state-sanctioned justice in the afterlife. For a people whose entire spiritual framework revolved around a successful transition to the field of reeds, the ultimate punishment for transgression often extended far beyond physical demise. It involved the deliberate denial of a proper burial and the sacred ritual of mummification, thereby condemning one's soul to eternal oblivion, a fate more terrifying than any earthly torment. Imagine being denied not just your life, but your very eternity, your existence utterly erased from cosmic memory. Tomb robbery in this deeply spiritual society was considered the most egregious transgression imaginable, a sin not just against property, but against both divine order and state power. It desecrated the sacred resting places of kings and nobles, directly threatening their immortality, and thus undermining the very fabric of Egyptian belief. The stability of the cosmos as they understood it depended on the undisturbed rest of the deceased, particularly the pharaoh, whose successful journey to the afterlife ensured the continued prosperity of Egypt. To violate a tomb was an act of cosmic rebellion met with the most severe retribution. Convicted tomb raiders faced horrific, often agonizing executions. Accounts from the reigns of Ramses II and Ramses IX paint a gruesome picture of the state's merciless response. Methods described include being roasted to death over a slow fire, a torturous prolonged demise designed to inflict maximum pain and psychological terror. Others faced impalement on sharpened stakes, a public and agonizing form of execution that ensured a slow, painful death. And beyond the immediate fatality, mutilation, noses and ears cut off was also common, a deliberate disfigurement meant to shame and brand the individual even before death. Such acts were not hidden. They were public spectacles designed to instill the deepest fear in the population, a visceral demonstration of the state's unyielding power. Following these brutal executions, the disfigured bodies of criminals, particularly tomb robbers, were then often denied proper burial rites. This was a crucial step in ensuring their eternal damnation. No mummification, no elaborate spells, no provisions for the journey through the underworld. Sometimes these bodies were even displayed publicly, occasionally mummified themselves as ghastly exhibits, serving as dire warnings of perpetual torment. This public display and the complete denial of eternal rest underscored a terrifying reality. Not only would their earthly lives be forfeited in the most painful manner imaginable, but their hopes for a joyous afterlife would also be obliterated. Their souls would wander aimlessly, eternally deprived of the field of reeds, a truly nightmarish fate for an ancient Egyptian. The societal expectation of a calm acceptance of fate in the face of death, a stoic resignation that permeated their texts and art, was underpinned by the state's terrifying power to enforce this. They transformed what might have been merely physical punishment into a terrifying spiritual sentence, a total annihilation of the individual's being. This absolute power, extending even beyond the grave, solidified the pharaoh's control over every facet of life and death, shaping daily choices and even the most private spiritual anxieties. This ever-present threat of eternal oblivion, combined with the crushing burdens of daily life, frequently pushed the peasantry to the brink, leading to desperate acts of discontent. This crushing burden of daily life, from the constant threat of starvation to the fear of eternal damnation, frequently pushed the peasantry to the brink of desperate unrest, leading to what we might call the seeds of discontent and occasionally outright peasant uprisings. You see, the relentless suffering was not merely a passive state of being, it was an active force stemming from a confluence of excessive taxation, which perpetually chipped away at their meagre harvests, unpredictable famines that could wipe out livelihoods overnight, and the pervasive corruption of local officials who often enriched themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. These were the tinder that could ignite the fragile peace. Historical accounts, though rare and often told from the perspective of the elite, offer grim glimpses into these periods of turmoil. The chaotic First Intermediate period, for instance, a time when central authority faltered, provides chilling details. The noble Unctifi, a powerful nomarch inscribed on his tomb, grim descriptions of his efforts during periods of soaring grain prices, rampant looting by desperate masses and starving peasants invading entire provinces in a desperate, frantic search for food. Imagine entire villages emptying people migrating en masse, driven solely by the agonizing certainty of starvation, a human tide desperately seeking sustenance. While these desperate movements weren't a formal organised ikki, in the Japanese sense of a peasant league or uprising, they certainly shared characteristics of defiant collective action. They were often spontaneous, chaotic expressions of profound desperation, born not of political ideology, but of a primal need to survive. And predictably, such movements, whether organised or not, were almost invariably met with swift and brutal suppression by the authorities once the central power reasserted itself. The cost of such defiance was invariably high, yet the desperation often outweighed the fear of retribution. Perhaps one of the most poignant testaments to the severity of this oppression was the fear of royal anger. It was so profound that starving refugees driven from their homes by famine would sometimes choose to risk death on the roadside from hunger, enduring agonizing days of deprivation, rather than returning home to face the Pharaoh's wrath, the inevitable punishment for having abandoned their fields or dared to seek food elsewhere. This illustrates the extreme level of control and the terrifying consequences of perceived disobedience, a level of fear that could literally drive people to their graves through inaction rather than risk direct confrontation. Such localized famines and chronic food shortages, often exacerbated by devastating pest infestations, like the relentless locust plagues, kept many farmers permanently on the knife's edge of subsistence. This precarious state made them fertile ground for sudden, desperate revolts, even if short-lived and poorly organised. A single bad harvest, a single corrupt official's arbitrary demand, could be the final straw pushing an entire community into open defiance. The crushing burden of debt, which often forced families into bond servitude, a condition just a step above outright slavery, contributed significantly to social instability and the perpetual potential for larger-scale peasant uprisings. Despite the brutal, almost certain consequences of failure, the sheer weight of suffering would occasionally overwhelm their innate fear, leading to moments of desperate collective action. These fleeting moments of defiance, however, were often quickly overshadowed by the Pharaoh's formidable power, particularly his brutal war machine which exacted its own profound human cost. The formidable power capable of crushing internal dissent found its grandest and most devastating expression in the Pharaoh's brutal war machine, which, while bringing immense wealth and expanding the empire, exacted an agonizing human cost from the common Egyptian. You see, pharaohs like Thutmose III were not mere administrators. They were aggressive warrior kings, leading relentless military campaigns that spanned decades and stretched the empire's borders into distant lands. While these conquests are celebrated in monumental inscriptions detailing captured spoils and vast territories, the human toll was a grim ledger kept in countless unrecorded lives. The endless campaigns meant that the very backbone of Egypt, its farmers and artisans, were torn away from their fields and workshops for months, sometimes even years at a time. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It violently disrupted livelihoods, leaving fields untended, crafts unproduced, and families struggling to survive without their primary providers. Imagine the pervasive hardship for their families back home, forced to endure prolonged absences, uncertainty, and often profound poverty, all for the glory of a distant war. This conscription was not a choice. It was a demand, a heavy burden placed upon the shoulders of the vulnerable. Conscription into the army was for the average Egyptian man a deeply traumatic experience, a journey into a world of unimaginable hardship and fear. You might be a simple farmer one day, and the next you'll march for weeks through scorching deserts, your feet blistering, your body aching. The exposure to debilitating diseases like dysentery and heat stroke was rampant, silently decimating ranks before a single arrow was loosed. And then came the terrifying reality of chaotic hand-to-hand combat, a brutal, visceral experience where life could be extinguished in an instant by a bronze spear or an enemy's axe. Ancient sources, though often glorifying the pharaoh's prowess, recount gruesome details of these battles. An army officer might describe clambering over piles of enemy corpses, a horrifying tableau of fallen men. And the meticulous accounting of victory included Thutmose ordering the severed hands and penises of slain foes to be meticulously catalogued as bloody receipts of empire, a chilling testament to the brutal efficiency and dehumanization of warfare. For the inhabitants of conquered lands, the treatment was consistently and overtly cruel, a deliberate policy of terror designed to crush resistance and ensure subjugation. Cities were not merely captured, they were burned to the ground, their structures reduced to ash and rubble. Their people were murdered indiscriminately, often summarily executed or enslaved, marched back to Egypt in chains to serve the pharaoh's will. Prisoners of war faced a fate perhaps even worse than death. They were beaten, tortured mercilessly for information, or simply as a show of power, and often executed publicly as a chilling warning to others, their suffering a grim lesson for any who might consider defiance. Thutmose III's capture of Joppa, where he hung up its chief in front of the city, exemplifies these terroristic spectacles, a raw display of overwhelming fear designed to instill unquestioning obedience through sheer, unadulterated brutality. This constant need for manpower, both for the colossal building projects and the ceaseless military campaigns, meant that forced labour and military conscription were pervasive and brutal tools of the state. They extracted an immeasurable toll in sweat blood and lost lives from the masses. The common people of Egypt literally built and maintained this vast empire through sheer suffering, their individual pains and sacrifices largely unrecorded, overshadowed by the grand narratives of their god-king. Yet even within this rigid, brutal system, human beings sought to connect, to find meaning, and to navigate the complexities of their social fabric through a perilous tightrope of etiquette and culture. Within the harsh realities and brutal governance, we've explored the non-material world of culture and relationships, provided another albeit tightly constrained layer of existence for the Egyptians. You might think of it as a delicate, intricate web of unspoken rules and expected behaviours, a perilous tightrope walk of social etiquette that governed every interaction. Social communication was not simply about conveying information. It was a complex dance where every word, every tone, every subtle gesture could carry profound consequences, shifting dramatically based on one's social status. To miss a cue, to offer an unintended slight, could have far-reaching and often negative repercussions. Politeness and deference were paramount, especially when addressing superiors, whether a village elder, a local scribe, or a high-ranking official. Specific forms of address, often lengthy and deferential and precise body language, a bowing of the head, a lowering of the gaze were meticulously observed to signify respect, and more importantly to avoid any accidental offence. It was a social performance, a constant negotiation of power dynamics through subtle cues. The ability to navigate these nuances was crucial for maintaining one's position and avoiding trouble. Subtle communication was highly valued, a preferred mode of interaction that prioritized harmony over directness. Direct confrontation, with its potential for open conflict and loss of face, was often rigorously avoided. Instead, people relied on indirect hints, subtle suggestions, or elaborate, often lengthy apologies to preserve social harmony and diffuse potential tensions. You might find a complex, circuitous route to express even a simple disagreement, all to avoid a direct challenge. The ability to control one's emotions and maintain composure, particularly in challenging or humiliating situations, was seen as a mark of virtue and essential social discipline. A public outburst, a display of raw anger or despair, would likely be met with disapproval, perhaps even seen as a sign of weakness or a threat to the established order. The ideal was a stoic, measured demeanour, even in the face of adversity. Silence itself could be a powerful tool conveying respect, deep contemplation, or even unspoken disapproval, depending entirely on the context and the social standing of the participants. It was a nuanced language of its own, capable of communicating volumes without a single uttered word. For those attuned to it, the pauses, the unspoken meanings were as important as the spoken ones. Humour, while certainly present in some forms, was a perilous tightrope walk requiring incredibly careful judgment. You couldn't just crack a joke. It had to be exquisitely timed and precisely aimed to avoid unintended disrespect or offence within such a highly structured and easily offended society. The wrong joke aimed at the wrong person, or at the wrong time, could lead to severe social penalties or worse. The laughter, when it came, was perhaps more of a release than a pure expression of joy, a temporary break from the relentless pressure of social conformity. This constant vigilance, this pervasive adherence to social graces, wasn't merely about being polite. It was an ingrained cultural discipline, a public performance that reflected and reinforced the very core principle of their existence, upholding Ma'at. This intricate dance of social etiquette and the constant vigilance over communication were not arbitrary rules, but rather external manifestations of a far deeper, all-encompassing cultural discipline, the unwavering imperative of upholding Ma'at. For the ancient Egyptians, Ma'at was far more than a concept. It was the foundational principle guiding every single aspect of their lives, embodying truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. Its maintenance was not just a noble goal, but the Pharaoh's sacred, overwhelming duty, and by extension the responsibility of every Egyptian. You were born into a world where your very existence was tied to this cosmic balance. Individuals were expected to live their lives in accordance with Ma'at, a principle that influenced their daily moral choices, their social interactions, and their strict adherence to societal norms. This pervasive belief system acted as a powerful form of cultural discipline, a constant internal measure that encouraged upright conduct and discouraged transgressive behaviour. It was the bedrock for maintaining harmony in both the earthly realm, the social order and the state, and the divine realms, ensuring the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and the world continued its benevolent cycle. The pressure to conform to uphold this cosmic principle was immense, subtle yet pervasive, shaping decisions from the mundane to the monumental. Yet in a fascinating, almost ironic twist for such a rigid society, ancient Egypt also displayed a remarkable fascination with the transgressive and chaotic. You can find evidence of this in humorous papyri, light-hearted artistic depictions that show misbehaving gods or animals acting unnaturally often, in a way that cleverly subverts the established order. These weren't serious blasphemies, but rather fleeting safe outlets for imagining a world turned upside down, a momentary escape from the pitiless logic of Ma'at that governed every waking moment. It was a pressure valve allowing for a brief controlled release of the anxieties stemming from such a rigidly ordered existence. However, this momentary dalliance with chaos was quickly subsumed by the overwhelming reality of their lives. The constant struggle against literal chaos and profound suffering in daily life, the famines, the floods, the diseases, the oppression, starkly reinforced the spiritual emphasis on maintaining Ma'at both individually and collectively. Every time the Nile failed to flood adequately or a plague swept through the village, it would have felt like a direct assault on Ma'at, necessitating an even stronger commitment to order and balance in their own lives. It was a cosmic battle, an eternal struggle between order and chaos profoundly reflected in personal conduct and daily choices. This profound commitment to Ma'at, while bringing a sense of order, also led to another intensely personal yet universal preoccupation, the terrifying gamble of the afterlife, the ultimate destination of their souls. That profound commitment to Ma'at guiding every waking moment ultimately flowed into the ancient Egyptians' deep, almost obsessive preoccupation with death and their complex belief in a harrowing journey through the underworld. You see, death was not an end, but a terrifying gamble, a passage through a perilous landscape filled with fearsome monsters and perilous tests, before just perhaps reaching the paradise of the field of reeds. It was a journey fraught with uncertainty, demanding meticulous preparation and unflinching courage, or at least a meticulously prepared tomb to navigate. The ultimate truly terrifying judgment awaited them, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. Imagine standing before Osiris and a pantheon of gods, your very soul on the scales. A heart heavier than the feather, laden with sin unbalancing the cosmic order, would be instantly devoured by the terrifying demon Amit, a creature part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. This wasn't merely a symbolic consumption. It led to a second death, a complete and utter annihilation of the soul, eternal oblivion. For a people who believed so fervently in an afterlife, this was the most dreadful fate imaginable, a horror that eclipsed any earthly suffering. This profound, pervasive fear of the second death drove enormous investment in ensuring a successful passage to the afterlife. It wasn't just for pharaohs. Commoners too dedicated significant resources to this desperate gamble for eternity. This included elaborate tomb preparation, often years in the making, and the careful stocking of grave goods, everything from miniature servants of Shabdi to daily necessities, all meant to provision the deceased for their eternal journey. They also meticulously painted tombs with spells and incantations from the Book of the Dead, a sort of ancient travel guide for the underworld, hoping to ward off dangers and guide their souls safely through the treacherous trials. It was a spiritual insurance policy desperately hoped to guarantee their fragile shot at eternal life. Mummification was deemed utterly crucial, a non-negotiable step, as the soul, the ka and ba, required an earthly body to return to a vessel for eternal existence. This extensive and incredibly expensive process, lasting up to 70 days, was undertaken not only by the elite, but remarkably by even commoners whenever possible, highlighting the universal anxiety about the afterlife. Imagine the financial strain the sacrifices a family would make just to ensure this crucial ritual, a testament to their unwavering belief. The lavishness of pharaonic burials, such as the treasure-filled tomb of King Tutankhamun, reflected an almost endless costly effort to secure their fragile shot at eternal life, filling their resting places with enough wealth to appease any god or overcome any obstacle. But even these opulent tombs were not truly safe from the very human desires they sought to escape. The constant spectre of tomb robbery haunted Egyptians, a pervasive fear that undermined their meticulous preparations. This dread drove them to create hidden entrances, elaborate false doors, and to inscribe tombs with dire curses, invoking divine wrath, all desperate attempts to protect the sacred resting places of the deceased and ensure their undisturbed passage to eternity. This underscores the profound sacred significance of the deceased's undisturbed rest, which was literally a matter of eternal life or eternal oblivion. The afterlife was universally perceived as the only refuge from the cruelties of this world, an idealized field of reeds, where hunger, pain, and suffering were blissfully absent. It was a direct, longed-for inversion of their brutal daily realities, a spiritual oasis they desperately hoped to reach, a hope that also shaped the very practical realities of love, marriage, and family. That desperate yearning for a peaceful afterlife free from earthly suffering existed within the very constrained realities of daily life, particularly when it came to love, marriage, and family. You might hope for passionate romance, but for the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, marriage was fundamentally a pragmatic alliance across all social classes. It was a matter of social status, economic considerations, or political benefits, a strategic merger of resources and lineage. Genuine romantic love, though celebrated in poetry, often took a backseat to practical considerations like social status, economic advantage, or political benefits. It was a utilitarian arrangement designed for stability and continuation, not necessarily for emotional fulfillment. Girls, for instance, were often married off by their fathers at an alarmingly young age, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, to significantly older grooms. They had virtually no agency in choosing their partners. Their fates were sealed by their family's needs, their economic circumstances, or the desire to forge useful alliances. Imagine being a young girl, your future decided for you, your dreams and aspirations, if any, utterly irrelevant to the practicalities of the arrangement. A woman's primary role, and crucially her value in this society, were overwhelmingly derived from her fertility and her ability to produce children, especially sons, to ensure the family line continued. This reduced her identity in a very real sense to a biological function, her worth measured primarily by her reproductive capacity. Women in essence were considered the property of their fathers, and then upon marriage the property of their husbands. They largely lacked autonomy, unable to own or inherit property independently, except in extremely rare and highly specific circumstances, nor could they easily initiate divorce. It was a deeply constrained existence where your legal standing and personal freedoms were dictated by your male guardians. Wives were expected to be modest, obedient, pliant, and submissive, their days consumed by the relentless cycle of domestic labour. Picture yourself overseeing the household, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, spinning linen, and constantly tending to children. Their lives were a continuous, exhausting loop of essential domestic tasks, their efforts largely unacknowledged beyond their functional necessity. An intractable or barren wife, one who either resisted expectations or, more crucially, failed to produce heirs, especially sons, faced a terrifying prospect. She could be cast out by her husband, facing immediate destitution, beggary, or even prostitution. There was virtually no social safety net to catch them. Meanwhile, in a chilling testament to the patriarchal norms, a husband was legally permitted to physically discipline or even mutilate a disobedient wife for even trivial offences. And with no formal authorities inclined to intercede, her suffering was often confined to the private sphere of the home, considered an acceptable exercise of a husband's authority. The most harrowing reality for women, however, was the grim threat of death in childbirth. Consistently the leading cause of mortality for women during their reproductive years. With limited contraception, women faced multiple perilous pregnancies, each a terrifying ordeal for both mother and child, a gamble with life itself that often ended in tragedy. The continuation of the family line, the future of the clan, was literally paid for with the constant, terrifying risk of the mother's demise. This relentless procreative burden profoundly underscored the far-reaching influence of their all-encompassing clan identity. That relentless procreative burden profoundly underscored the far-reaching influence of their all-encompassing clan identity, or i.e., in ancient Egypt, where the individual was perpetually secondary to the collective. You see the modern concept of individualism, that cherished sense of unique personal freedom, self-expression and independent choice was largely an alien notion. Your identity wasn't something you carved out for yourself. It was fundamentally tied to your inherited role within the intricate social fabric of your family, your village, and ultimately the sprawling, divinely sanctioned state. Your personal sense of self was effectively stifled by the weight of tradition, by the unyielding expectations of your lineage, and by the relentless demands of the collective shaping every facet of your being from birth to death. From the moment you drew your first breath, your life was inherently understood as being in service to the god king and by extension to the state. Obedience wasn't merely a desirable trait, it was seen as the fundamental purpose of existence, a non-negotiable pillar upon which the stability of Ma'at, the cosmic order, firmly rested. You were in essence a vital component, a necessary cog in a grand divinely ordained machine. Personal desires were consistently relegated to a secondary, often irrelevant position compared to the greater good of the empire. This constant subjugation of the individual meant that your personal actions had far-reaching and profound implications, extending well beyond your immediate self to directly affect your immediate family and your broader lineage. Consider for a moment the immense social pressure, shame, or honour resulting from any individual's conduct directly impacted the entire collective standing within the community, often for generations. If you brought disgrace upon your family through a transgression, that indelible stain could follow your children, and their children, potentially affecting their future prospects, their marriage alliances, and their very social acceptance within the community. Conversely, an act of great honour, profound piety, or exceptional service could elevate the entire clan, bringing them respect and perhaps even minor advantages. This pervasive emphasis on collective responsibility and the shared experience of honour or shame profoundly influenced daily interactions and moral choices. It created a constant low-level fear of communal judgment and potential ostracism, reinforcing societal norms not just through the stern hand of state law, but through the deeply ingrained omnipresent pressure of family and community. The sheer scale of dedication of lives to monumental state projects, the pyramids, the sprawling temples, the vast irrigation networks starkly underscored this suppression of individual desire in favour of collective, divinely mandated goals. These colossal undertakings often involved generations of labourers, fathers and sons and grandsons, all toiling on the same project, their individual identities subsumed by the grand collective endeavour. It was a powerful, tangible testament to the immense power of ancestral and communal ties, where one's ultimate purpose was inextricably intertwined with the enduring legacy of their lineage and the eternal glory of their god-king. This deep, almost suffocating sense of collective identity meant that the internal world of the ancient Egyptian, even their private thoughts and unvoiced dreams, often revolved not around personal ambition, but around concepts of duty, tradition, and the unending struggle for communal survival within a world that was simultaneously magnificent in its achievements and brutally demanding in its daily realities. Such a pervasive sense of duty and the daily grind inevitably cast a long psychological shadow. Such a pervasive sense of duty and the daily grind inevitably cast a long psychological shadow, highlighting the human spirit's capacity for resilience, even in the face of overwhelming brutality, often finding its only true comfort in the spiritual promise of a better tomorrow. You see, amidst the relentless physical hardships and the pervasive anxieties, the ancient Egyptians developed a remarkably robust and intricate spiritual framework, one that offered solace and direction. This framework wasn't just a set of beliefs, it was a deeply ingrained worldview that infused every aspect of their existence, a constant dialogue between the earthly and the divine. Their gods were not distant abstract concepts, but active participants in their daily lives, responsible for the rising sun, the fertile flood, and the very breath in their lungs. This intimate relationship with the divine meant that religious rituals and practices were woven seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life. You might witness or participate in daily offerings to local deities at small shrines or seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural calendar, honouring the gods responsible for the Nile's bounty. These communal acts of worship provided a sense of belonging, a shared purpose, and a powerful coping mechanism against the relentless uncertainties of their world. The temples, those magnificent stone structures, were not just places of worship, but central hubs of economic activity and community life, providing a degree of stability and order in a chaotic existence. They were places where the sacred met the profane, where the divine intertwined with the very practical realities of grain storage and administration. Moreover, the profound belief in the afterlife, despite its terrifying gambles, offered an overarching sense of meaning and hope that transcended their immediate suffering. The promise of the field of reeds, a place free from hunger pain and all the brutal realities of their current existence, provided an ultimate escape, a serene inversion of their daily toil. This wasn't merely wishful thinking. It was a powerful motivator, shaping their moral choices and driving their dedication to elaborate burial preparations. Every tomb, every carefully crafted grave good, every spell from the Book of the Dead represented an act of hope, a tangible investment in eternal bliss. It transformed the inevitability of death from a terrifying end into a challenging yet ultimately hopeful transition. Even within the rigid social hierarchy, there existed opportunities for expressing devotion and finding personal connection to the divine, albeit constrained by one's status. While grand temple rituals were the domain of the priest and pharaoh, the commoner could still offer a simple prayer light, a small lamp, or leave a humble offering at a domestic shrine. This personalized spirituality allowed for individual solace and a sense of direct communication with the divine, bypassing the formal, often intimidating structures of state religion. It was in these quiet moments of personal faith in the shared rituals and in the grand promise of the afterlife that the ancient Egyptians found the strength to endure a resilience born from their unwavering belief that their suffering in this brutal world was but a prelude to an eternal, joyful existence. This profound spiritual grounding allowed them to confront the constant spectre of death with a degree of acceptance, viewing it not as an end but as a critical gateway, the preparation for which was an intricate and deeply meaningful process. This profound spiritual grounding allowing them to confront the constant spectre of death with a degree of acceptance, viewing it not as an end but as a critical gateway, manifested profoundly in their intricate and deeply meaningful burial customs. You see, these were not merely morbid rituals. They were elaborate, painstaking processes designed to ensure the deceased's successful transition into the afterlife, a final act of devotion and preparation that reflected their deepest hopes and fears. The entire process of mummification, from the careful removal of organs to the intricate wrapping in linen bandages, could last an astonishing 70 days. This lengthy, expensive undertaking was a clear testament to their unwavering belief in the physical body's importance for the soul's journey. Even for commoners, if resources allowed, there was an immense effort to undergo some form of preservation, albeit less elaborate than the pharaohs. Imagine the financial strain this would place on a family dedicating precious resources, perhaps even the equivalent of a year's harvest, to ensure a loved one's body was prepared for eternity. This was a profound act of sacrifice born from a desperate hope. The internal organs, with the exception of the heart believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, were carefully removed and preserved in canopic jars, each lid shaped like the head of a protective deity. This meticulous attention to detail reflected the belief that every part of the deceased needed to be intact, ready for the soul's return. The tomb itself was conceived not just as a burial place, but as a perpetual home for the deceased spirit, a mini-universe equipped with everything needed for the afterlife. Imagine the effort involved in preparing these resting places' walls meticulously painted with scenes of daily life offerings and protective spells, ceilings adorned with images of stars and constellations. These weren't just decorations. They were magical blueprints for a successful journey, a comprehensive survival guide for the deceased soul. Grave goods ranging from simple pottery and personal ornaments for the poor to vast treasures for the elite were carefully placed within the tomb. These items were not just symbolic, They were believed to become real and accessible to the deceased in the field of reeds, ensuring their comfort and continued existence. For the elite, the inclusion of hundreds of Ushabti figures' miniature servant statues meant that even in the afterlife someone else would handle the toil, a stark, unspoken contrast to the commoner's eternal reality. And then there were the spells and prayers meticulously inscribed on tomb walls, coffins and papyri like the Book of the Dead. These were not mere sentiments. They were powerful incantations literally designed to ward off the fearsome monsters and perilous tests of the underworld, to open pathways and to guide the deceased through the treacherous journey to the Hall of Two Truths where the heart would be weighed. Every word was critical, a precise instruction for navigating the spiritual bureaucracy of the afterlife. This meticulous preparation, this profound belief in a spiritual continuation, offered a powerful counterpoint to the physical brutality of their earthly lives. It was a testament to a society deeply rooted in the promise of eternity, a hope that fueled their endurance in the face of constant suffering. Yet even this eternal hope was not without its own set of earthly dangers and anxieties, particularly the grim threat of the living. The meticulous preparation and profound belief in a spiritual continuation, offering a powerful counterpoint to their brutal earthly lives, nonetheless existed in a world where even eternal hope was not without its own set of earthly dangers and anxieties, particularly the grim threat of the living. You see the very lavishness of pharaonic burials, such as the treasure-filled tomb of King Tutankhamun, reflected an endless costly effort to secure their fragile shot at eternal life. These were not simply grand gestures, they were intricate insurance policies filling their resting places with enough wealth and magical protection to appease any god or overcome any obstacle. Yet as history clearly tells us, even these grand protections were not truly safe. The constant spectre of tomb robbery haunted Egyptians from the lowliest commoner to the mightiest pharaoh. This wasn't just a concern for the living, it was a profound anxiety that undermined their meticulous preparations for the afterlife. The violation of a tomb was not merely a theft, it was a sacrilege, a disruption of the deceased's eternal rest, which could imperil their passage to the field of reeds. Imagine dedicating your entire life and savings to prepare for eternity, only for it to be undone by a common thief, your soul condemned to wander aimlessly because your physical resting place was disturbed. This dread drove people to desperate measures, creating hidden entrances, elaborate false doors, and inscribing tombs with dire curses invoking divine wrath upon any who dared disturb the slumber within. These were desperate attempts to protect the sacred resting places, underscoring the profound sacred significance of the deceased's undisturbed rest, which was literally a matter of eternal life or eternal oblivion. The sheer desperation driving tomb robbers, often themselves impoverished highlights, another layer of the brutality of Egyptian society, the extreme inequality that could push individuals to commit the most heinous of religious crimes. These were not always sophisticated criminal enterprises. Sometimes they were acts born of dire hunger and desperation, a last resort for survival in a system that offered no other recourse. The conflict between the pious desire for eternal rest and the grinding poverty that forced people to plunder the dead encapsulates a tragic paradox of ancient Egyptian life. It shows that even the most sacred beliefs could be challenged by the material realities of their existence. The state's response to tomb robbery, as we've noted, was swift and chillingly severe, reflecting its gravity. The horrific executions and post-mortem desecrations served not only as punishment, but also as a public reaffirmation of the state's power and its commitment to upholding Ma'at even in death. The condemned thief was not just killed, their body was often mutilated and denied proper burial rites, ensuring their second death, a complete annihilation of their soul. This served as a stark, terrifying warning, a grim spectacle designed to instill the deepest fear and reinforce societal order, by threatening the very thing Egyptians feared most, eternal oblivion. This constant interplay between the sacred beliefs and the brutal realities of life created a complex psychological landscape. You were striving for an ideal afterlife, meticulously preparing for it, but the constant threats, from nature, from the state, and even from desperate fellow humans, meant that true peace was a fleeting illusion even in death, and this battle for countless women often began in the intensely personal sphere of their own bodies and families. The constant interplay between the sacred beliefs and the brutal realities of life created a complex psychological landscape. You were striving for an ideal afterlife, meticulously preparing for it, but the ever-present threats from nature, from the state, and even from desperate fellow humans meant that true peace was a fleeting illusion even in death. This existential struggle for countless individuals, particularly women, often began in the intensely personal sphere of their own bodies and families, where the forces of fate could be especially cruel. In the midst of that continuous brutal battle for survival, the most intimate corners of an ancient Egyptian's life, those involving love, marriage, and family, were profoundly shaped and often constricted. You might wish for tales of grand romantic gestures, but the stark reality for most was that marriage fundamentally operated as a pragmatic alliance. Across all social classes, these unions were less about fervent affection and more about solidifying social status, ensuring economic stability, or securing political benefits. It was a functional merger of resources and lineages, designed primarily for the continuation of the family unit and the wide community, with personal emotional fulfillment often a secondary or even negligible consideration. For young girls, the constraints were particularly pronounced. They were frequently married off by their fathers at alarmingly tender ages, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, into arrangements with significantly older grooms. This meant they had virtually no voice in choosing their partners. Their personal fates were sealed by their family's needs, their economic circumstances, or the strategic desires to forge useful alliances. Imagine the psychological toll of having your future, your very companionship, decided for you before you'd even fully experienced childhood. A woman's primary purpose, and indeed her perceived value within society, stemmed overwhelmingly from her fertility and her ability to produce children, particularly sons, to ensure the family line's perpetuation. This societal emphasis, though practical, could reduce her identity in a very real sense to a biological function, with her worth measured largely by her reproductive capacity, rather than her intellect, spirit, or individual character. Women, in essence, largely existed as property first of their fathers, then of their husbands upon marriage. This meant a pervasive lack of personal autonomy. They generally couldn't independently own or inherit property, save for exceedingly rare circumstances, nor could they easily initiate divorce. Their existence was profoundly constrained with legal standing and personal freedoms dictated by their male guardians. Wives were expected to be modest, obedient, pliant, and submissive, their days consumed by a relentless cycle of domestic labour. Visualize the ceaseless tasks overseeing the household, the laborious grinding of grain for daily bread, the brewing of beer, the spinning of linen, and the constant care of numerous children. Their lives were a continuous, exhausting loop of essential domestic duties, their efforts often taken for granted, and largely unacknowledged beyond their functional necessity. The consequences of failing to conform were severe. An intractable or barren wife, one who either resisted expectations or, more crucially, failed to produce heirs. Especially sons faced the terrifying prospect of being cast out by her husband, often leading to immediate destitution, beggary, or even prostitution. There was virtually no social safety net to catch them. Meanwhile, in a chilling testament to the patriarchal norms, a husband was legally permitted to physically discipline or even mutilate a disobedient wife for even trivial offences. With no formal authorities inclined to intercede, her suffering was often confined to the private sphere of the home, considered an acceptable exercise of a husband's authority. The most harrowing reality for women, however, was the grim threat of death in childbirth. Consistently the leading cause of mortality for women during their reproductive years. With limited contraception, women faced multiple perilous pregnancies, each a terrifying ordeal for both mother and child, a gamble with life itself that often ended in tragedy. The continuation of the family line, the future of the clan, was literally paid for with the constant, terrifying risk of the mother's demise. This relentless, procreative burden profoundly underscored the far-reaching influence of their all-encompassing clan identity. That relentless, procreative burden profoundly underscored the far-reaching influence of their all-encompassing clan identity, or i.e. in ancient Egypt, where the individual was perpetually secondary to the collective. You see the modern concept of individualism, that cherished sense of unique personal freedom, self-expression, and independent choice was largely an alien notion. Your identity wasn't something you carved out for yourself. It was fundamentally tied to your inherited role within the intricate social fabric of your family, your village, and ultimately the sprawling, divinely sanctioned state. Your personal sense of self was effectively stifled by the weight of tradition, by the unyielding expectations of your lineage, and by the relentless demands of the collective shaping every facet of your being from birth to death. From the moment you drew your first breath, your life was inherently understood as being in service to the God-King, and by extension to the state. Obedience wasn't merely a desirable trait, it was seen as the fundamental purpose of existence, a non-negotiable pillar upon which the stability of the cosmic order firmly rested. You were in essence a vital component, a necessary cog in a grand, divinely ordained machine. Personal desires were consistently relegated to a secondary, often irrelevant position compared to the greater good of the empire. This constant subjugation of the individual meant that your personal actions had far-reaching and profound implications, extending well beyond your immediate self to directly affect your immediate family and your broader lineage. Consider for a moment the immense social pressure, shame, or honour resulting from any individual's conduct directly impacted the entire collectives standing within the community, often for generations. If you brought disgrace upon your family through a transgression, that indelible stain could follow your children, and their children, potentially affecting their future prospects, their marriage alliances, and their very social acceptance within the community. Conversely, an act of great honour, profound piety, or exceptional service could elevate the entire clan, bringing them respect, and perhaps even minor advantages. This pervasive emphasis on collective responsibility and the shared experience of honour or shame profoundly influenced daily interactions and moral choices. It created a constant low-level fear of communal judgment and potential ostracism, reinforcing societal norms not just through the stern hand of state law, but through the deeply ingrained omnipresent pressure of family and community. The sheer scale of dedication of lives to monumental state projects, the pyramids, the sprawling temples, the vast irrigation networks starkly underscored this suppression of individual desire in favour of collective divinely mandated goals. These colossal undertakings often involved generations of labourers, fathers and sons and grandsons, all toiling on the same project, their individual identities subsumed by the grand collective endeavour. It was a powerful, tangible testament to the immense power of ancestral and communal ties, where one's ultimate purpose was inextricably intertwined with the enduring legacy of their lineage and the eternal glory of their God-King. This deep, almost suffocating sense of collective identity meant that the internal world of the ancient Egyptian, even their private thoughts and unvoiced dreams, often revolved not around personal ambition, but around concepts of duty, tradition, and the unending struggle for communal survival within a world that was simultaneously magnificent in its achievements and brutally demanding in its daily realities. Such broad collective ambitions inevitably extracted a profound toll. Such broad collective ambitions inevitably extracted a profound toll on the populace. You see the monuments that stand as enduring symbols of ancient Egypt's grandeur, the pyramids, the temples of Luxor and Karnak, the colossal statues, were not simply feats of engineering. They were manifestations of an almost unimaginable human sacrifice. Each stone, each meticulously carved inscription, each towering column represented countless hours of back-breaking labour, often performed under inhumane conditions by individuals whose names are now lost to the sands of time. Consider the sheer logistics involved in constructing something like the Great Pyramid of Giza. It wasn't just about hauling millions of tons of stone, it was about housing, feeding and managing tens of thousands of labourers for decades. The worker villages, while organised, were still crowded and basic, and the work itself was relentless. Imagine the discipline, the sheer unyielding will required to marshal such a vast workforce day after day, year after year. This was a testament to the state's absolute power and its capacity for ruthless efficiency. The overseers, often equipped with whips and unburdened by modern notions of human rights, ensured that the work continued rain or shine through heat stroke and exhaustion. This wasn't a project of choice for the common labourer. It was a mandate enforced with the full brutal weight of the Pharaoh's authority. The pursuit of architectural and monumental immortality, a core tenet of their pharaonic belief system, came at an extraordinary human cost. Lives were shortened by injury, disease, and sheer physical exhaustion. Families were disrupted by conscription into these labour gangs, leaving children and elders to fend for themselves, exacerbating the cycle of poverty and hardship. The grand narratives of royal piety and divine favour, etched onto the very stone these labourers moved, often obscured the grim reality of their suffering. These were silent victims of ambition, their pains and sacrifices swallowed by the magnificent scale of the project, their stories untold in the official histories. Moreover, the maintenance of such an ambitious centralised state with its monumental projects and aggressive military campaigns required a constant, efficient bureaucracy. The scribes, while part of the elite, faced their own relentless pressures, tasked with meticulously documenting everything from grain harvest to conscripted labourers to battlefield spoils. Their work, though intellectual, was crucial to the state's functioning, and any error or inefficiency could have severe repercussions. The very system designed to maintain Mayat, to bring order and prosperity, simultaneously created and perpetuated a cycle of demand that extracted a brutal price from its populace. So when you gaze upon the magnificent remnants of ancient Egypt, try to remember not only the golden pharaohs and the soaring pyramids, but also the countless anonymous lives that were poured into their creation. These were lives lived under the brutal grip of an inescapable social hierarchy, a capricious economy, and the relentless fury of nature. They faced constant threats, endured back-breaking labour, and navigated a world where personal comfort was rare, and death, both earthly and spiritual, was an ever-present concern. Yet within this crucible of suffering they built a civilization that endures a testament to a resilience forged in the fires of adversity. This profound paradox, this beauty born of brutality, leaves us with a deep sense of wonder and perhaps a quiet appreciation for the more gentle comforts of our own time. This profound paradox, this almost unbelievable beauty born of unrelenting brutality, truly leaves us with a deep sense of wonder, and perhaps as the quiet of your space deepens a more nuanced appreciation for the comforts of our own time. You see, the grandeur of ancient Egypt in all its golden splendour was not merely built on stone and sand. It was built on the sweat, the silent suffering, and the almost unimaginable endurance of its people. Every towering monument, every meticulously carved inscription, each towering column whispers not only of artistic genius and engineering prowess, but also of lives lived under a crushing weight. From the earliest dawn of their civilization, The social pyramid ensured that power and resources flowed relentlessly upwards, creating an existence for the masses that was precarious and often agonizing. Their individuality, their personal freedoms were routinely swallowed by the collective demands of the state, a systemic dehumanization that viewed them as mere cogs in the Pharaoh's grand divine machine. The grip of the core economy, relentlessly tied to the fickle whims of the Nile, meant that every year was a gamble. A good flood brought life. A poor one brought the terrifying spectre of widespread famine, forcing people to resort to desperate measures, even unthinkable ones. Too much water and your village could vanish overnight. This constant gnawing anxiety, a low hum of dread in their collective consciousness, shaped every planting, every harvest, every anxious glance towards the river. Add to this nature's relentless fury. The scorching sun delivering heatstroke, the sudden descent of locust plagues, the lurking apex predators in the river and desert, and the insidious ever-present threat of disease carried by the smallest creatures. Life was a continuous negotiation with forces largely beyond their control, a daily reminder of their profound vulnerability. Then there was the deeply personal reality of their existence, the cramped vermin-infested mud-brick hovels offering little respite, the relentlessly monotonous diet that left populations perpetually teetering on the edge of malnutrition, and the rudimentary hygiene that ensured constant discomfort and the pervasive spread of illness. Imagine the ceaseless itch of lice and fleas, the omnipresent stench of waste, and the physical toll of living with bodies perpetually dirty and often unwell. But beyond these daily discomforts lay the truly back-breaking labour that consumed most lives from dawn to dusk. From ploughing fields under a relentless sun to hauling colossal stones for monumental projects, their bodies were pushed to breaking point, often resulting in crippling injuries and deformities that mark them for life. Even childhood was a brutal gauntlet, with appallingly high mortality rates and the swift onset of labour for those who survived. It's enough to make you truly appreciate a clean bed and a full pantry, isn't it? And finally, the overarching mechanisms of power and control added another layer of brutality. The Pharaoh's absolute authority, enforced by a stark and arbitrary justice system that often resorted to torture, left individuals with virtually no rights. Crimes against the state or divine order, especially tomb robbery, were met with horrific executions and the ultimate spiritual punishment, the denial of eternal rest, a second death in the afterlife. Even the Pharaoh's formidable war machine, while bringing wealth and expanding the empire, extracted a truly agonizing human cost, tearing farmers from their fields and subjecting them to the horrors of conscription, disease and brutal combat. Yet within this crucible of suffering, the ancient Egyptians forged a unique culture, navigated complex social etiquettes, and clung to profound spiritual frameworks, finding meaning and hope in the promise of an afterlife free from the very hardships that defined their every earthly breath. It is this incredible endurance, this resilience born from such immense adversity, that truly elevates their story beyond mere dates and dynasties. And with that thought, as the last echoes of ancient Egypt settle softly around you, we can begin our gentle journey back. As the final echoes of ancient Egypt settle softly around you, allow the whispers of their brutal realities to gently fade, replaced now by the quiet hum of your own present moment. We've journeyed through a world where life was a constant negotiation with hardship, a demanding existence under a blazing sun and a capricious river. You've walked in spirit through cramped mud-brick homes, felt the strain of unending toil, and perhaps glimpsed the profound anxieties that haunted their days and nights. It was a life profoundly different from our own, a stark reminder of how far the human experience has shifted through the vast stretches of time. Now, as the comfort of your surroundings envelops you, take a soft breath. Let the distant echoes of their struggle simply dissolve into the stillness. There is no need for worry here, no fear of famine or the unpredictable Nile, no threat of monumental labour under a harsh overseer. Your bed is soft, your home is secure, and the challenges of your day, however real, are miles and centuries away from the ancient struggles we've just explored. Just as the Egyptians found solace in the promise of their field of reeds, a serene paradise beyond earthly pain, may you now find your own refuge in the quiet tranquillity of this moment. Let the weight of history gently lift, leaving behind only a quiet understanding, a deeper appreciation for the simple, comforting rhythms of your own life. Rest now deeply and peacefully,